The ship sat in the dark water of the seventh dock, like something that did not belong here. It was too long, too wide. The hull was irregular, not smooth and white like those of all the other interstellar civilizations that had settled on that aesthetic after centuries of refinement. This hull was patchy, angular in places, as if it had been built in anger and no one had ever returned to smooth out the edges. 3 massive engine arrays stood at the rear, 2 secondary arrays on each flank, and artillery ports not yet open, sealed beneath panels that most visiting engineers mistook for armor plating, because who in the known galaxy needed that many artillery ports on a single vessel? The dockers called it the Beast. Its official designation was the prototype Class 1 UES Harbinger, a United Earth ship that had cost 17 years of classified budget, 6 directors of the Global Defense Initiative, 1 very loud international scandal regarding misappropriation of funds, and the careers of at least 4 politicians who had asked too many questions about where the money was going. Commander Elina Vaskes stood at the observation window above the 7th dock and stared at it. She held a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She hadn't noticed. She watched the Beast the way a person looks at something they have created with their own hands, and still cannot quite believe it came to fruition the way a sculptor looks at a finished piece, still unable to find the seam where the work ended and the miracle began. They called again, Director Malik Chen said. He walked over and stood beside her at the window, a tablet tucked under his arm. The same exhaustion was etched deep into his face, not the exhaustion of a bad night, but the exhaustion of a decade. The Imperial Ambassador wants an official response to the ultimatum before the 48 hours expire. I know, Elina said. The Council is meeting in 3 hours. I know that, too. Chen looked down at the ship. He was the 6th director. He was the one who hadn't resigned, hadn't been fired, and hadn't asked loud questions, only quiet questions in the right offices to the right people. He had supported the project's funding for 9 years. He had developed gray hair that hadn't been there before the project began. He had a way of standing very still when he was frightened, which most people mistook for calmness. They sent the full complement, he said. 412 ships. Recon satellites confirmed it this morning. Elina finally took a sip of the cold coffee, winced, and said nothing. 412, Chen repeated, as if the number could have a different meaning the second time. I heard you, Elina. He paused. Down below them, 2 dockers in orange jumpsuits were performing a final calibration check on the Harbinger's secondary array. They moved across the hull with scanners, tiny against the ship's flank like ants inspecting the leg of a sleeping horse. The Council will want to know your position, Chen said formally. My position is the same as it has been for the last 3 years. We built this. Let's use it. 40 years before Elina Vaskes stood at that window, humanity had received the first confirmed signal from outside the solar system. Not a probe, not wreckage, but a message deliberately structured, unmistakably intentional, transmitted on a frequency that required a civilization to know what a frequency was before using it. The message roughly translated to, "We know you are there, do not do anything yet." It had taken humanity 18 years to figure out who we were, the Interstellar Dominion, which humans quickly shortened to the Empire because no one wanted to say the full name. The Dominion was, without irony, the dominant political body of the known galaxy. 41 member races, 170 inhabited systems, a military force that had concluded 3 wars in 2 centuries, none of which lasted longer than 8 months, because nothing the losing side possessed could compare to what the Empire brought to the table. They had faster-than-light travel. Humanity did not. They had energy shields. Humanity did not. They had weapons firing coherent beams of accelerated particles at ranges that turned distance into a joke. Humanity had nuclear warheads and chemical rockets, which the Empire's first contact team studied with the same polite, suppressed amusement with which a professor watches a child explaining how they think electricity works. The first contact went well, in the sense that a job interview goes well when both sides know the candidate isn't qualified and the job offer isn't coming. Humanity was granted observer status, not membership, not an alliance. Observer status meant Earth got a seat in certain halls, was told about some things that were going to happen, and was allowed to watch them happen. The Empire built a relay station at the outer edge of the solar system, assigned a small diplomatic team to orbit, and sent a trade delegation every few years to see if Earth had produced anything worth buying. Mostly, the Empire watched to see if humanity would do anything dangerous before it gained the power to be truly dangerous. For 30 years, the answer was no. What humanity did quietly, and without submitting the appropriate reports in accordance with the Observer Status Charter, was read everything the Empire ever published about engines, shields, and weapon technologies. They studied the design philosophies of 20 alien civilizations, took notes, argued more, and held very long, very loud conferences in bunkers beneath 3 different mountain ranges on 3 different continents. Engineers, physicists, and ballistics experts sat across from each other and took every concept the Empire had ever made public, asking, what would we do differently? The Empire built energy shields that absorbed incoming fire and dissipated it as heat. Humanity looked at this and said, what if, instead of absorbing and dissipating, the shield disrupted the beam's coherence at the point of contact? That was a different question. It led to a different answer. The Empire built beam weapons that fired along a single coherent axis. Humanity looked at this and asked, what if we fired along multiple axes simultaneously and allowed the interference pattern to deal the damage? Another question, another answer. The Harbinger was the result of humanity asking 30 years' worth of different questions and building them into something. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated. It didn't look like the accumulated aesthetic taste of 41 civilizations. It looked like humanity had built a ship in anger. The council met in a hall beneath Geneva. 47 people in a room, designed for 30, which told you how many extra eyes wanted to be present for this particular conversation. Elina sat at the far end of the table. She had changed from her work clothes into a uniform, dark blue with a single silver stripe on the collar. It was simple, because she had designed it herself, and because she had always considered medals on military dress uniforms a form of lie. The chairman of the council was a man named Burkov, calm in the way competent bureaucrats learn to be calm when they know the room is watching them. He laid out the situation in clean, orderly sentences. The Empire had delivered its ultimatum 7 days ago. Formal language, diplomatic phrasing, but the meaning was not sugar-coated. Earth was building military hardware in violation of observer status rules. The Empire considered it a threat to regional stability. Earth had 48 hours now, 26 hours, to formally disarm and surrender the Harbinger for recycling. Otherwise, the Empire's corrective fleet would intervene. On the agenda, Burkov said, is the question of whether we comply. The room had opinions. Elina listened. Some were afraid, and she understood that 412 ships was a real number. The casualties from an orbital bombardment of Earth was a second number, and it didn't require long arithmetic. Some were angry the way people get angry when they have been nobodies for a long time and now suddenly feel the possibility of being someone, but don't know what to do with that feeling. Some tried to find a third option, a diplomatic path, a delay, negotiations, anything that wouldn't require making the decision on the agenda. After 40 minutes, Burkov looked at Elina. Commander, he said, your assessment. Elina sat with her hands flat on the table, her gaze direct. She hadn't flinched when he spoke. The Empire sent 412 ships. This is not a police action. This is not a corrective fleet. This is an armada. They sent 412 ships to take 1 ship from us. Silence. They are afraid of the Harbinger, she said. They saw the satellite data. They ran their own assessment, and they sent 412 ships, which tells me that whatever number they got, modeling what the Harbinger could do, it scared them. The man 3 places to her left, one of the generals who had opposed the project for most of his life, said, or they sent 412 ships because it is an overwhelming display of force intended to end this without a fight. Same thing, Elina said. If they were confident we couldn't hurt them, they would have sent 20 ships with an angry letter. 412 is what you send when you are certain. The room went quiet again. My assessment, Elina said, is that we will not give them the ship. We launch, and we find out who was right about what it can do. She received authorization at 3-0-0. Not unanimous, not even close to unanimous, but enough. She returned alone to the 7th dock. The dock was running a skeleton night shift, just the necessary observers, and 1 technician at the far end performing a thermal cycle on the propulsion systems. The beast stood in the dark water. The hull lights were burning in a low, amber standby mode, and in the dim light, it looked like something that had always been here, as if it had grown out of the seafloor, as if the water had one day decided to create something with edges. Elina walked up the gangway, and the ship accepted her weight and apologized for nothing. The bridge was smaller than most expected. Ships the size of the Harbinger, in imperial design, had bridges the size of basketball courts, all with curved screens and open space, because the Empire's design philosophy always prioritized the psychology of command, the sense of space, the power of a captain standing in the center of a wide hall seeing everything at once. The Harbinger's bridge was the size of a large living room, 8 stations, 1 command chair, central, with direct connections to all ship systems hardwired into the armrests, and screens wrapped around 3 sides. The ceiling was low enough for a tall person to feel comfortable, not strange. It was designed for work, not for show. Elina sat in the command chair and opened the crew manifest. 61 people, the smallest crew ever assigned to a vessel of that class in the history of human space travel. Though history of human space travel didn't really exist yet, so the record was new and theirs alone. She read every file. She knew where each of them had come from, what they were good at, what they did wrong under pressure. She had handpicked all 61. She keyed the ship-wide comms. "This is Commander Vaskes," she said. "We launch in 6 hours. Sleep if you can. If you can't, take your stations and run the checks. Either will do." She cut the feed. Outside, through the high observation windows of the dock, the sky above the ocean was still dark. In approximately 26 hours, 412 Imperial ships would exit hyperspace at the edge of the solar system. They would form up, they would deliver their final ultimatum, and the Harbinger would be there to answer. Elina opened the weapons list on her console, scanning it item by item, as she always did, not because she didn't know it by heart. She knew it by heart, but the process of scanning it was what she needed. A way to feel the reality of what they had built. 32 primary rail accelerators, 16 coherent destructors, 6 torpedo tubes loaded with kinetic penetrators, weapons with no name in the Imperial catalog because the Empire had never thought to build them. A shield array, a drive system, 14 other systems that still had no public names because they had been developed in those underground bunkers and had never left them. She reached the end of the list and leaned back. Somewhere in the most secure strategic databases in the galaxy, the Imperial Admiralty had a file on the Harbinger. She had no doubt of that. They had observation satellites. They had a diplomatic team in orbit. They had almost certainly gathered everything they could. What they had gathered was the ship's exterior, the hull, the general dimensions, the dock configuration. They had seen the artillery ports, or at least some of them, and made their estimates. What they had never seen was what the guns did. No one had. The Harbinger was a prototype. It had never fired in combat. It had never been tested at real range with a real threat. On the other hand, everything Elina knew about its capabilities came from simulations, range tests, and engineers with very confident voices and very large equations. She was about to find out if the equations were right. She closed the list, opened the navigation display. The solar system sprawled before her in cool blue light, all the planets in their slow, patient orbits. Earth, a small, warm dot close to the center. She stared at it for a long time, then cleared the display and went to sleep. They exited hyperspace in a formation so precise it looked rehearsed. The Imperial fleet executed this specific mass arrival maneuver in a tight grid formation. For 200 years, 412 ships returning to real space within a 30-second window, occupying positions at exact intervals, locking their coordinates before the light of their own arrival had time to cross the distance between them. It wasn't just military strategy, it was a statement. It said, "We do not arrive. We appear everywhere at once, wherever you look." The Empire called this maneuver the curtain. It worked. It always worked. The Harbinger's long-range sensors picked up the IR arrival signatures beyond Neptune's orbit, and the bridge screens lit up with 412 contact points, blossoming on the display like a field of red flowers opening all at once. The tactical officer, Sergeant Diana O., counted them under her breath. She reached 100, stopped counting, and just looked at Elina. Elina looked at the display. "Plot the formation," she said. "Already executing," O said. The formation resolved on the main screen. A wide arc, deep and multi-layered. How you place ships when you want to present a wall that has no edge, you can go around. The Imperial flagship was in the center rear, the command position, and also the position of maximum protection, surrounded by 3 full squadrons of destroyers. On the flanks, carriers and fast attack craft were scattered across the front line of the formation like teeth. It was a textbook corrective fleet position. Elina knew this because she had read every document Earth had ever collected on Imperial Fleet doctrine, and this was Chapter 1. "Open a channel," she said. The communications officer, a young man named Torres, who possessed that specific stillness of a person who had prepared very thoroughly for something and now discovered that preparation and reality were not the same thing, opened the fleet-wide channel. Static, then a voice. The translation came through the ship's system in even, clear tones, devoid of inflection, which was a fair limitation of machine translation, and, Elina thought, probably an accurate reflection of how the voice on the other end felt about this conversation. "This is Admiral Grand Caterin of the 1st Corrective Fleet, acting under the orders of the Interstellar Dominion. You have ignored the terms of your last notification. You have 1 hour to surrender the vessel designated as Harbinger and issue a stand-down order. In 1 hour, we begin." The channel remained open. It waited for a response. Elina leaned forward in the command chair. "Admiral Caterin," she said, and her voice traveled across the gap between them and across 412 ships, each of which was larger than anything humanity had ever put into space until this moment. "This is Commander Elina Vaskes, UES Harbinger. We are not surrendering the ship." A pause. "Commander." The translated voice of the Admiral held something that wasn't quite amusement. It was the voice of a man who had delivered this ultimatum before and always received the same result, and he was deciding how much patience to spend on a variation. "You have 1 ship. We have 412. "I know," Elina said. "We are ready when you are." She nodded to Torres. He closed the channel. Admiral Caterin was 73 by human standards, though his species counted differently. He had commanded fleet operations in 6 separate theaters of conflict in his career. He had overseen the conclusion of 2 wars and the start of 0, which was a statistic he was proud of. He had never lost a ship in an engagement that he didn't count as acceptable losses. He had never lost a flagship. He stood on the bridge of the ID Sovereign Will, which was 800 meters long and carried a crew of 3,000 and weapons enough to turn a mid-sized city into craters. And he looked at the Harbinger's sensor readings on his tactical screen. 400 meters plus or minus half the length of his own ship. 1 ship. Crew estimate, based on dock observations gathered by his intel teams, somewhere between 60 and 300. The range was wide because the internal layout of the ship hadn't been fully mapped, and the humans had tried hard to keep anyone from getting close to it. The weapons visible on the hull were substantial for a human ship. Unknown efficiency, unknown range. The hull design was so irregular that standard targeting algorithms were yielding slightly wider scatter estimates than usual, which had been noted in the tactical briefing and marked as a minor complication. Minor. 400 meters. 1 ship against 412. Caterin had encountered species that surprised him before. He respected it. He had standing orders fleet-wide. No species is to be underestimated in the first 60 seconds of an engagement, because 60 seconds is the time to discover what you don't know. And you want to be alive at the end of 60 seconds to be able to adjust. At 60 seconds, he expected minor adjustments. He gave the order to advance. The Harbinger moved first. This surprised Caterin. A defending ship, outnumbered by such a ratio, did not advance. It held position, tried to maximize defensive advantages, tried to find a geographic feature, a planet's gravity well, a debris field, anything to narrow the front of the engagement. But it did not accelerate straight toward 412 ships with full power ahead. "It's moving toward us," his tactical officer said. "I see," Caterin said. "Hold formation. Let it come." The Harbinger crossed the distance at a speed that was faster than his intelligence briefing had suggested. Not dramatically faster, but enough to note. Caterin noted it, recorded it, and continued to watch. On the bridge of the Harbinger, Elina watched as the formation on the main screen grew larger, as everything does when you move toward it, and decide not to stop. "Ranged ahead elements," she said. 40K, O said. "Closing," she said. "Fast attack craft at the front line of the formation. Shields are active. All weapons ready." The sound the Harbinger made as its weapons came to full readiness was a low, vibrating hum in the hull that you felt in your teeth before you heard it. The crew had felt it in the test trials. They knew what it was. Knowing what it was didn't make it feel any less like the ship was waking up. 30K, O said. Elina looked at the fast attack craft on the front line of the formation. Small ships, fast, designed for high-speed combat sorties against larger targets. The Empire used them as a first wave. "Send them in fast, hit hard, pull back. Let the destroyers pass through the disorganized defense. Good tactics against everything the Empire had ever fought. Very good tactics. Target the head elements, Elina said. Rail accelerators. Full spread. Fire when we reach 20K. Acknowledged, said Weapons Officer Kara Andy, whose voice was the calmest on the bridge. 20K meters. Fire. The Harbinger fired, and the sound was nothing like what anyone expected. No dramatic roar, no shaking recoil. Only a sharp change in air pressure on the bridge and a high metallic ringing of the hull as 32 rail accelerators discharged simultaneously, sending kinetic penetrators outward at a speed that wasn't a number you spoke of in polite company. The Empire's fast attack craft had shields, good shields. The standard coherent beam weapons of their era were designed to be absorbed by these shields. The energy dissipated and left as heat. The shields were built on the assumption that energy needed to be managed. Kinetic penetrators were not energy. They were dense metal rods moving very fast. The first 3 fast attack craft in the Empire's front line ceased to exist in any meaningful structural sense within 4 seconds. Not destroyed in the sense of a dramatic explosion, though there was a little of that, but broken, torn apart. The penetrators went in and came out the other side, taking most of the ship's interior with them. On the ID Sovereign Will, Katarin's tactical screen updated. 3 fast attack craft destroyed 30 seconds into the fight. He stared at the screen. Report, he said. Unknown weapon type, his tactical officer said, and in his voice was something that Katarin. Shield penetration on all 3. Total structural failure. No energy signature on the incoming. Reads as solid mass projectile high velocity. The officer named a number. Katarin looked at the number for a moment. That is impossible, he said. It wasn't denial. It was the honest assessment of an engineer who knew what velocity existing propulsion technology could accelerate a mass to, and the number he was looking at was on the other side of that border. Sir, his tactical officer said, they are firing again. The second volley hit the second row of the formation. 4 destroyers, not fast attack craft. Destroyers were heavy combat vessels with reinforced hulls and shield arrays that absorbed direct fire from Imperial heavy cruisers without failing. The penetrators hit all 4 in a 2-second window. 2 destroyers lost their bows. 1 lost main power and went dark. 1, the one whose shield array was at full power and whose armor plating was oriented toward the incoming fire, absorbed the impact, held for a moment, and then a secondary explosion from the compromised shield system finished what the penetrator had started. On every ship in the formation, tactical officers were submitting reports that said, in variation, the same thing. Unknown weapon, unknown speed. Shields ineffective. Immediate tactical correction recommended. Katarin received the reports, read them, and stood very still. Advance the formation, he said. Full offensive. All ships open fire on the Harbinger. I want overlapping fields. Everything we have. The Imperial fleet possessed firepower capable of splitting the moon if concentrated. 48 remaining ships firing simultaneously at one target was not a tactic that left the target space for negotiation. The Harbinger flew straight into it. The Empire's coherent beam weapons hit the Harbinger's shields, and something happened that Katarin had not seen in 73 years of combat experience. The beams didn't splash, they didn't heat the shield and dissipate. They struck the boundary of the shield, and the coherence broke. The tightly organized wave structure of the beam fell apart, just as a perfect line of soldiers falls apart when the ground beneath them suddenly collapses into chaos. The energy was still there. It was still hitting. But the coherent particle beam, having lost its coherence, was only a fraction of the weapon it had been a moment before. The Harbinger's hull lit up with impacts. The screens on Elina's bridge blinked with amber warnings. Shield strength falling. Systems registering load. One exterior panel on the port side shows elevated heat, not 0 damage. The math of 408 ships was still 408 ships, but the Harbinger kept moving. Return fire, Elina said. Torpedoes. Target the carriers on the starboard flank. The torpedo tubes opened, and 6 larger-class kinetic penetrators flew out, followed by rail accelerators cycling for a third volley, and the coherent destructors on the Harbinger's flanks were already doing something to the space around the ship that the Empire's targeting system would take 3 minutes to notice and longer to understand. On the lead Imperial destroyer ID Iron Point, the targeting solution for the Harbinger was clean 1 second, gone the next. The ship was still visible visually. On the sensor array, it was there. But the lock-on, the precise, calculated firing solution that every weapon system on every Imperial ship required before discharging was constantly shifting, recalculating, shifting again. The weapons officer on Iron Point ran diagnostics, ran them again, and reported to the captain that the targeting system was operating normally, and the problem was that the target was not cooperating. The captain sent that report up the chain. Up the chain, it joined 17 other identical reports from 17 other ships. The Harbinger's third rail accelerator volley hit the Imperial formation. When Katerin read the reports, he looked up from the reports to his tactical screen. He stood there for a moment, longer than he intended. He had given this fleet one task. One task any competent military force in the known galaxy could perform. Find one human ship, an experimental vessel that until today had never fired in anger. Take it apart. What he saw on the tactical screen was not the start of completing that task. What he saw was 16 lost contacts. One ship, 19 contacts lost in less than 4 minutes. He hadn't adjusted his tactical actions enough in 60 seconds. He was adjusting them now, and what he needed, what he hadn't brought because he hadn't thought he would need it, was something that worked. "Give me the formation, commanders," he said. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who had been surprised before and knew that surprise was information, and information was how you won. He used all his experience, all that discipline, and all that professional calm to stay ahead of what was happening, which was that the Harbinger was not behaving like a prototype. It was behaving like a weapon that had been waiting a very long time to be used. Outside, in the darkness between the planets, the beast was just getting started. Katerin's first tactical correction was the swarm. He pulled the fast attack craft, what was left of them, out of the front line and sent them wide, not forward, but in a wide arc around the Harbinger's flanks while the main formation held the ship's attention from the front. The fast attack craft were designed for this. Close the distance quickly, fire at point-blank range where targeting solutions didn't need to be precise, where the stress on shields from multiple simultaneous hits at close range could mount faster than the shield array could compensate. It was the tactic that had destroyed 3 heavy cruisers in the Asharian conflict 9 years ago. The fast attack craft split and ran wide, flanking the Harbinger from both directions at full speed, 46 ships converging from 2 directions. Elina watched them approach on the rear tactical display. "Oh," she said. "Counting 46, O said. 23 on each side. They are fast. I see them." Elina looked at the main display. The front of the formation was still advancing, still firing, still trying to crack the shields from the front. A double threat. Front and both flanks simultaneously. A good move. I read about it in the captured tactical manuals. I was ready for it. "Indeedy," she said. "Flank arrays ready. Fire on my command. Full spread on both sides simultaneously." The fast attack craft were approaching. They were very fast. They were 30 seconds away from effective firing range when the panels along the Harbinger's flanks opened. Panels that the Empire's observation satellites had photographed and registered as armor, because Imperial ship designers didn't put secondary weapon arrays along the entire flank of a vessel because ships weren't designed that way. Weapons were put in the nose and stern, and maybe point defense systems on the sides. But these panels opened, and behind each one were cannons. "Mark," Elina said. Both flanks fired simultaneously. The fast attack craft didn't have time to turn. They were already committed. Already in the final stage of approach, already at a speed where turning was a process requiring distance they no longer had. The Harbinger's flank arrays were not rail accelerators. Those were installed in the nose, heavy, designed for long-range combat. The flank arrays were something else. Shorter range, higher rate of fire. They had been designed in a bunker in New Mexico by weapons engineer Dr. Fatima Akafar, who had spent 11 years thinking about one specific question. What do you do when something is closing in on you? What you do, Dr. Akafar had decided, is fill the available space with enough metal moving fast enough to make the available space uninhabitable. The fast attack craft on both flanks stopped their approach. Some of them stopped everything else. Katerin's tactical screen updated. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time, doing the arithmetic. And the arithmetic said he had lost 31 fast attack craft and 14 destroyers in less than 8 minutes, and the Harbinger's shields were at. His tactical officer gave him the reading. 71%. 71%. He had thrown the entire firepower of his frontline formation at this ship for 8 minutes and lowered its shields to 71%. He had lost 45 ships. Admiral. It was his second in command, an officer named Vez, who possessed the careful voice of a man choosing words very precisely. Their shield profile is not degrading at the rate I recognize. With our current rate of attrition, I know what the rate is, Katerin said. Still level, still a calm voice, but something beneath it now that Vez heard and didn't comment on. Give me the formation, commanders. I need to talk to all of them. On the observation platform of the neutral relay station above Mars, the diplomatic representative of the Empire to Earth, a creature named Advisor Ash, watched the battle on the long-range sensor feed, both pairs of hands pressed to the console in front of him. Ash had been assigned to the Earth observation station 6 years ago. In that time, he had filed 240 reports, most of which described the slow and unconvincing progress of humanity in becoming a minimally relevant member of the galactic community. He had attended their conferences, he had watched their news, he had eaten their food, some of which he considered truly interesting, but most of which he considered a cry for help. He had also watched the construction of the Harbinger from a respectful distance through the relay station's optics. He had filed reports on it. He described its dimensions, its suspected weapon load, its unusual hull configuration. His reports were received, processed, and assessed by the Empire's Strategic Assessment Division as medium importance. He watched the tactical feed now and did his own arithmetic. The same arithmetic Katerin was performing on the other side of the engagement, and he was arriving at the same place. He opened a channel to the nearest Imperial Communications relay station and began composing a message for the Strategic Assessment Division that he personally felt they deserved to receive at high volume. He didn't send it. Not yet. He continued to watch because there was something else, something the feed had just shown him that he wasn't sure he had read correctly. He zoomed in on the Harbinger. The ship's shield reading was dropping. 68%, 64%. He watched. And then the Harbinger did something that Ash, in 6 years of watching humans, had learned to identify as purely human. It did something that no sensible designer of a civilization's ship would have included in the vessel's systems, because no sensible civilization would have considered it a good idea. The Harbinger accelerated straight toward the center of the formation. Not away, not to the side, no defensive maneuver of any kind, straight into the heart of the Imperial fleet, where the destroyers were thickest and the fire was concentrated, at a speed that said, either the people inside have resigned themselves to death, or they know something about the next 30 seconds that the Empire does not. He pressed his hands against the console even harder. On the bridge of the Harbinger, every screen was amber or red. Shields at 58% and falling. Port flank shows 2 panel failures. Engine output nominal, but thermal readings on secondary arrays are rising above the comfortable range into the range that engineers label with phrases like, not recommended for prolonged operation. Range to center of formation, Elina said. 80 kilometers, we are inside their formation. Repeating, we are inside, O said. Being inside a formation, surrounded, was not a place you wanted to be against 400 ships unless you had specifically designed one of your weapon systems for this exact situation, which Dr. Akafer and her team had. And that was why Elina had brought them here, rather than away. Collapse array, Elina said. Charge it. Weapons Officer Ndidi looked at her console. She knew this moment would come. She had run the simulation 100 times, read the specs, attended the briefing where Dr. Akafer explained it with that precise composure of a person describing something very ordinary. She understood it intellectually, every time. Understanding it intellectually and sitting at the weapons console while a ship was surrounded by 400 enemies, and the commander said, charge, were 2 different experiences. Charging complete, she said. Her voice was still calm. She was proud of that. The collapse array was not in the Empire's tactical database. It wasn't in any tactical database. It had been designed from scratch by humans based on a principle that Imperial physicists had described in theoretical papers 30 years ago, and then set aside because the engineering required for its practical realization was considered too difficult and the tactical application too situational to justify the resources. The situational application was this. If you are surrounded, and you need to stop being surrounded, and you are willing to accept some risk to your own ship's systems to make it happen. The collapse array generated a highly focused field of gravitational disturbance, extending approximately 3 kilometers in all directions from the ship and lasting approximately 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, everything within a 3 kilometers radius that possessed a propulsion system would experience a shutdown of its propulsion system. A hard, non-soft shutdown, a forced interruption of the drive field at the hardware level, the type of interruption whose recovery required time, and sometimes resulted in the loss of parts of the drive system. 4 seconds, 3 kilometers. Everything in that bubble stopped. The charging tone in the hull was different from the readiness vibration of the weapons. It was higher, longer. The crew called it the howl, because that was exactly what it was. The howl grew. Katerin felt it before his instruments reported it, not through some alien sense, but through the simple, physical fact that when a gravitational disturbance field of such magnitude began to charge, it interacted with the mass of nearby objects in a way that the inner ear of most sentient species interpreted as wrongness. The sensation that the floor was not where it had been a moment before. He had never experienced this sensation on a ship before. "What is that?" he said, not as a question, not as a command, but simply as words that escaped. His tactical systems had no answer. They were looking for an energy weapon signature, a torpedo launch, a beam charge. They were not looking for what was approaching, because they had no record of what was approaching. Howl at peak. "Fire," Elina said. The collapse array discharged. The silence after it was the strangest thing. Not a true silence, the bridge was still full of alarms. The hull was still registering impacts. Torres was still reading incoming messages that now overlapped on a single frequency. But the specific noise that a massive fleet makes when it fires everything it has at one target ceased, because the ships within the 3 kilometers radius of the Harbinger stopped. 47 ships dead in space. Drives disabled, power redirected to emergency systems. The crews were running diagnostics that would give them nothing useful for another 6 minutes. 6 minutes during which 47 combat ships were firing on no one. The Harbinger's shields showed 54%. Elina looked at the display. 47 ships stopped. The rest of the formation was outside the range of the field, still active, but the geometry of the formation had just been torn apart. The center was dead, which meant that ships on the edges had a decision to make, whether to break through their own disabled comrades to re-engage or hold position while the formation regrouped. "Rail accelerators," Elina said. "Target the recovered ships first, the heaviest." She didn't like this part. She knew it would happen, and she had come to terms with it before the launch. But she didn't like it. The stopped ships couldn't maneuver. They couldn't raise shields to full power. They weren't defenseless. The point defense systems were running on independent power, and some of them managed to partially restore shields in the allotted time. But partial shields against rail accelerators at that distance was arithmetic that ended in one way. The Harbinger took apart the stopped ships in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. When the collapse array field dissipated and the remaining stopped, ships began to restore their drives. 12 of them recovered in a debris field where 17 of their comrades in the formation had previously been. Katerin stood on the bridge of the Sovereign Will and received the updated casualty report and stood with it for a time. 69 ships destroyed, more damaged. He had 343 ships left, and the Harbinger, which was still functional and still inside his formation, and still accelerating toward him, specifically toward the Sovereign Will in the center of the formation, with its shields rising back to 70% as the fire diminished, and the array had time to recover. "Admiral." It was Vess again, with that same careful voice. "At the current rate of attrition, the formation is not working." "No, sir," Katerin said. "Break them up. Dismantle the formation. Maximum dispersion. Individual ship engagements. Force them to pursue individual targets." This was the opposite of everything Imperial doctrine said. You did not disperse a fleet. You maintained concentration of force. Concentration of force was the principle that had won every engagement for 2 centuries of Imperial military history. But concentration of force assumed the enemy could not sit inside your formation and turn off your engines. Vess gave the order. The formation began to drift apart. The tight grid dissolved outward. Ships broke away in different directions. The organized wall was turning into a scattering. Elina watched this on the main display. The tight grid was dissolving outward. She picked up her coffee. It was still warm. She hadn't thought about coffee since the launch. "They are dispersing," O said. "I see what we do," Elina said. She drank the coffee, set the cup down. "Head for the flagship," she said. "Everything else will follow." O looked at her the same way Torres did, the same way Ndidi did from the weapons console. Because if you pursue the flagship is where the Admiral is. And the Admiral now, with his formation breaking apart, now that his numbers were wrong and his tactics were wrong and everything he had brought to this battle was not the right tool for the job, the Admiral would do one of 2 things. He would find what worked, or he would run. Elina was betting on him running. She needed him to run, because she needed the rest of the fleet to see him do it. "Set course for the sovereign will," she said. "Full power." The Harbinger turned and went after the largest ship in the Imperial fleet. And behind them, on every screen, the scattering of 343 combat ships watched as it approached. And somewhere in that scattering, on the bridge of the largest and most protected ship of the corrective fleet, Grand Admiral Caterin looked at the sensor readings of the Harbinger rushing at him, and for the first time in 40 years of command, felt something for which he had no name. He had a name for it by the time he gave his next order. The name was flight. Caterin did not call it a retreat, he called it a tactical relocation. He gave the order to Vez in the clipped, precise language of a commander who had made a decision and needed it executed, before the reasons behind it were examined too carefully. He needed distance from the Harbinger. He needed to take the sovereign will outside the radius of what that disturbance field was, recalibrate his targeting systems, and reassess the engagement from a position that didn't have a problem rushing at him at full power. "Tactical relocation," Vess repeated. An order without comment. The sovereign will turned. It was a big ship. The turn took time. During that time, every ship in the scattered formation, 343 ships, spread over a volume of space equal to a small country, received the same sensor data, the same image on their tactical screens. The flagship of the Empire, the largest and most protected ship of the corrective fleet, was turning away from a single human ship. No one said anything on the bridges. No one had to. Elina watched as the flagship turned on the main screen. "There it is," she said. Not to anyone in particular, but to the room, to the ship. The Harbinger felt different in that moment. Or maybe she felt different. It was the same thing when you had commanded for long enough that the boundary between you and the ship blurred until it was hard to explain to people who hadn't sat in that chair. "It's running," O said. And in her voice was something that wasn't quite disbelief. It was the sound of a person watching something happen that they had calculated as probable and still didn't quite believe it. "When does it happen?" "It is relocating," Elina said dryly. And indeed he made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. "Maintain pursuit," Elina said. "Let it keep running. Fire at the flagship." Torres looked up from comms. "Commander, we are receiving signals from 14 separate ships in the formation. They are requesting. It looks like they are requesting terms of surrender." Elina looked at him. 14. 15 now, Torres said. She knew this was possible. She had prepared it as a possibility. The logic was clean. The morale of a fleet was connected to its command structure. Like a building connected to its foundation. You didn't destroy the building by hitting the walls. You went to the foundation. If the flagship runs, the fleet sees the flagship run. And a fleet that had seen its admiral run from one ship had a question that needed answering. Not a tactical question, but a personal one. What exactly are they still doing here? "Do not respond to the surrender requests," Elina said. "Hold them in waiting." Torres opened a channel to Earth, to Director Chen in the Ops Center beneath Geneva. Malik Chen had not sat down in 4 hours. He had watched every second of the battle on the main display. He had watched as the tactical number grew. 10 ships, 20, 40, 609, and he felt something he couldn't exactly name. A mixture of satisfaction and terror, and a third, for which there was no word. The feeling of watching what you had believed in for 17 years prove itself in the most violent way possible. The room around him was silent, with that specific silence that happens when everyone is watching something that is bigger than all of them, and no one wants to be the first to speak and break the spell. When Elina's channel opened, the room came alive. "Commander," Chen said. Her voice over the channel was level, unexcited, unrelieved level as always, and that was why he had hired her. "The flagship is running. 15 ships are requesting surrender. 328 ships are still active, but the formation has dissolved, and they are watching their admiral leave. I need you to do it." Chen had been waiting for that phrase for 4 hours. He had been waiting for it in another sense for 17 years. "Are you sure?" he said. "Not out of doubt, but just for the process of verification." "Do it now," Elina said, "while he is still running, while everyone is watching." Chen nodded to the communications officer across the room. The transmission went out on all open frequencies of the solar system, on all channels the Empire used for fleet comms, on all diplomatic bands, on all public frequencies. Relay stations picked it up, and it spread at the speed of light and reached Advisor Ash's console on the observation platform above Mars before it reached the fleet, because Mars was between the sun and the engagement zone, and Ash was closer. He read it again. Then he sat down, which his species usually didn't do at consoles designed for standing work. And he sat there with the transmission on the screen and the tactical feed showing the fleeing Sovereign Will and the Harbinger in pursuit and 328 remaining combat ships floating in a scattering. And he felt the specific sensation of a person watching history move. The transmission was from Director Malik Chen of the United Earth Global Defense Initiative. It spoke in clear and uncomplicated language that the Harbinger was a prototype Class 1. 0 meant proof of concept. 1 meant first in class. Included in it was a secondary document, verified, sealed with 3 layers of authentication, for the authenticity of which the Imperial Intelligence Department would need about 40 minutes to confirm. The secondary document was a production manifest, 7 more ships, each of which included upgrades based on the Harbinger's design lessons. Each of them was larger. Each was armed with the systems the Harbinger carried, plus systems that didn't fit into the Harbinger's hull because the Harbinger's hull was a first attempt and the teams building it were still learning. 4 of the 7 were more than 60% complete. The transmission ended with one sentence from Director Chen, which he had written himself at 3 a.m. alone in his office 6 months before the ultimatum arrived, because he had always known the ultimatum would come and wanted the words ready. The sentence read, "We were building, and we were not idle, and we are not who you decided we were." Katerin received the transmission. He was in the middle of his tactical relocation, which in the last 6 minutes had covered a distance that could no longer be described as tactical. When the transmission reached his communications array, his officer put it on the screen without comment, because the officer had read it and had no comments. Katerin read it. He had very good control over his facial expressions. He had cultivated that control for 40 years, because a commander whose face showed something gave away information, and information was always the most valuable thing on the battlefield. His face now showed something. Vez saw it, didn't have time to look away fast enough, and saw the Admiral's face do something it had never done in 6 years of working together. Not panic, not fury. Something quieter and worse than both. The expression of a man recalculating a task and discovering that every variable he had built his plan on was a wrong number. 7 ships, Katerin said quietly, almost to himself. "Sir, we sent 412 ships to stop one," Vez said. "And they have 7, more than one of which is further along in construction than the Harbinger was when we first noticed it." Vez said nothing, because there was nothing to say. "They let us see the prototype," Katerin said. He was no longer speaking to Vez. He was speaking it aloud, which he hadn't done before a subordinate since he was a junior officer. "They registered it. They let us observe its construction. They didn't issue concealment orders at the dock. They let us see one ship and count its artillery ports and take our photos and build our assessment." He paused, because they wanted us to bring everything we have against that one they were willing to show us. The tactical display still showed the Harbinger behind them, still pursuing, not closing the distance, not attempting to. Elina was too smart for that. She was keeping the distance exactly what it was, holding the Sovereign Will in a controlled run that lasted exactly as long as she wanted, but not lagging. 328 ships watching their admiral run, and somewhere behind Mars, 4 ships, more than 60% complete. Katerin looked at the transmission again, at the production manifest, at the attached images of hulls taking shape in Earth's deep docks, photographed so recently that the timestamps would survive authentication. One of the ships in the images was larger than the Harbinger by enough that the scale markers made it very clear. He thought about what the Harbinger had done to his fleet today. He thought about what that larger ship would do. He opened the fleet-wide channel. He spoke 6 words that had never been spoken in his career and that he would have said this morning he was incapable of saying. 6 words that would spread at the speed of light from this solar system and reach the Imperial home systems in due time and enter the historical record of the Interstellar Dominion in a volume that would not fade. "To all ships, stand down, hold position. Do not retreat," he said. He stopped pretending, but he did not advance either. Hold, because he needed to think, and he needed to talk to his command council, and he needed to be in a place where the Harbinger was not rushing at him while he did so. The fleet held position. The Harbinger held position. The solar system fell quiet. On the relay station above Mars, Advisor Ash was composing a message not for the Strategic Assessment Division. He was finished with the Strategic Assessment Division, which had evaluated his previous reports as medium importance, and could now shove that assessment where he was too professional to point out. He was composing a message directly to the Imperial Supreme Council. 7 members, the governing body of the Interstellar Dominion, representing 41 member races and 170 inhabited systems. The ones who had authorized this fleet and this ultimatum and signed the order that had sent 412 ships to seize one human prototype. He was trying to write the message in the careful, neutral diplomatic language his training required. He had spent 20 years preparing to write in this language. He had always been good at it. He struggled. What he wanted to write was, "You have made a mistake of a type that cannot be corrected." Instead, he wrote an accurate account of the engagement, the current status of the fleet, the contents of Director Chen's transmission, and a formal recommendation to the Council to consider the possibility of opening direct diplomatic contacts with the human government before the 4 ships that were more than 60% complete were 100% complete. He attached the production manifest. He sent it with the highest priority available to a field advisor, a classification he had never used before because he had never been in a field situation that required it. He leaned back and looked at the tactical feed. The Harbinger sat in the dark between the scattered remains of the corrective fleet, shields at 83% and growing, as the pause in the battle allowed the array to recover. Hull temperature was returning to the normal operating range. Still, patiently. Ash had spent 6 years watching humans their news, conferences, arguments, their strange and persistent habit of putting effort into things that other civilizations looked at and decided weren't worth the trouble. He had watched them build the Harbinger with a certain kind of polite, professional disbelief. Not because he thought they couldn't do it, but because he assumed they were doing what civilizations at Earth's stage of development always did. Build what they were shown how to build. They weren't building what they were shown how to build. They were building something else. Something that no one had shown them, something they looked at existing work for and decided they could do differently, and then went underground and did it differently quietly for 17 years, smiling at all the diplomatic receptions and submitting status reports for observer status, allowing Ash to photograph their only visible ship from orbit. He thought about the 7 ships in the manifest. He thought about the fact that the manifest was a document they decided to release, not the full picture. A document they decided at this particular moment to let the Empire see. There was a shadow of a question beneath that thought that Ash didn't want to look at directly but couldn't stop looking at, which was, if this is what they decided to show us today, what else are they still not showing us? Elina took the Harbinger off battle alert after 4 hours. Not completely. Shields remained active. Weapons remained in a state of readiness. The crew remained at their posts. But she lifted the full alert status because full alert burned the crew, and the crew had been burning since before the launch, and she needed them to be sharp for everything that would follow. Everything that followed would be decided by what Katerin did in the next few hours. He would call home. He had already called home. She saw the heavy encrypted transmission leaving the Sovereign Will on a private channel, beam directed to the relay network, bouncing to the Imperial home systems. He was filing his report and asking for instructions and waiting for someone with more authority than he had to look at the situation and decide how much a situation like this was worth. She knew how much it was worth. She had known it for 17 years. Chen's voice came through her earpiece on a private channel. "The Supreme Council will want to talk." "Good," she said. "They will push hard. They are humiliated, and they are frightened. And those are uncomfortable things for a civilization that hasn't been frightened in 200 years. "Good," Elina said again. "Elina Malik, we just showed them what we built." She looked at the main display. The scattered fleet, the fleeing flagship that was now holding position, the solar system around them, quiet. "Now we will show them what we want." Chen was on the line. "The council is already arguing about terms." "They can argue," Elina said. "We have time." She looked at the stars, not through a window. The Harbinger had no windows on the bridge, only screens, only data. But she looked at the image of the star field on the main display, the way people always looked at stars when they sat in the middle of something big and tried to hold its shape in their minds. 328 ships holding position. A flagship that had run. A transmission sent across the galaxy that read, "We are not who you decided we were." And 7 ships on the water at home, growing. The Harbinger sat in the dark and waited, and the darkness was theirs. The Supreme Council's response came 11 hours later. Not from Katerin, not through the fleet's communications array, but through the official diplomatic channel, the one through which 40 years of observer status reports, trade delegation schedules, and polite reminders to follow the rules had passed. The channel through which, until this moment, Messages had always traveled in one direction, from them to Earth. Instructions, assessments, notifications. This time, a request traveled through it. The Imperial Supreme Council, the governing body of the Interstellar Dominion representing 41 member races and 170 inhabited systems, had officially requested a diplomatic meeting with representatives of the United Earth government at the earliest mutually beneficial time. Mutually beneficial. Torres read it twice from the screen to make sure he had translated it correctly. Then he turned to Elina with the expression of a person who very much wanted to say something but couldn't find words big enough. Elina read it herself. "Tell them tomorrow," she said. 14. Geneva. They can use the same conference room they used for the observer status meetings. She specifically chose the same room. Chen had asked if she wanted something larger, more official, more in keeping with the occasion. She said, no. The same room, the same table. She wanted whoever walked in there from the Empire to sit in the same chairs where humanity had sat for 30 years receiving instructions. And she wanted that to be the first thing they felt walking through the door. Torres sent the response. Katerin began moving his fleet out 6 hours after the stand-down. Not quickly. The flight was over. It had happened once, and it would remain in the records. And he couldn't fix that, but he wouldn't do it again. The movement was slow and orderly. The fleet reformed into a loose formation and moved back toward the edge of the system where the hyperspace jump points were, moving at a speed that said, "We are leaving because we decided to leave," even if everyone watching knew the real sentence was longer and ended differently. He filed his post-combat report from the bridge of the Sovereign Will as the fleet moved. It took him 4 hours to write a document that usually took 2 pages. The standard post-combat report format had fields for enemy strength, enemy tactics, engagement outcome, casualties taken, casualties inflicted. The casualties inflicted field was a problem. The answer was, 1 ship, slightly damaged. He typed it, looked at it, and typed it again as if the second time might change it. It didn't. He didn't edit it, he didn't soften the language, and he didn't find frames that made the number less true. He was the type of officer who had filed honest reports for 40 years. And he wasn't going to stop because an honest report was the worst document he had ever written. He filed it. Then he did something that was not in any standard post-combat report format. He wrote a separate document, personal, not filed through the official system, addressed directly to the Supreme Council. 3 paragraphs. The first described as clearly as he could what the Harbinger actually was. Not the intelligence assessment, not the photos, not the projected capabilities that had led to the decision to send 412 ships, but what he saw, how it acted during the 4 hours of combat, catalogued without drama. The second paragraph consisted of 1 sentence. It read, "The assessment was wrong, and I accepted the assessment, and that is also my fault." The third paragraph read that whatever the outcome of the diplomatic meeting was, he recommended the council not enter it from a position of pride, that pride was not a resource they currently had in stock. He sent it, closed the file, and looked at his fleet moving in its slow withdrawal. 291 ships. He had arrived with 412. He was leaving with 291. And 11 of them were damaged to varying degrees, and they had all seen their flagship run. He had commanded this fleet for 8 years. He knew these ships as a person knows the rooms they had lived in. He knew the captains' names. He knew their service records. He knew which of them would have the hardest time dealing with what was in his post-combat report, because they were the type of officers who calibrated their understanding of the world by the invincibility of the Empire. And today, they had knocked that calibration out of alignment in a way that wouldn't be easy to recalibrate. The fleet crossed the edge of the system. The jump drives charged. Katerin looked one last time at the sensor display, the solar system behind them, a small, warm planet close to the center. The Harbinger, which had ceased pursuit in the middle of the system and now, according to the latest sensor readings, stood motionless in the dark, watching them leave. He had one thought. Not tactical, not strategic, just a thought. 30 years. They did all this in 30 years. Their species had been spacefaring for 900 years. The Empire had existed for 200 years. Each member civilization had come into the galactic community with centuries of development behind it, with accumulated knowledge, with the slow, patient building of a species that had time. Humanity had watched for 30 years, and had made itself into this in 30 years. He didn't know what to do with that thought, so he put it aside and gave the order to jump, and the fleet was gone. The diplomatic meeting was not what the Imperial delegation expected. They sent 3 people. The senior diplomatic envoy, Tausurus, who was the most experienced negotiator on the Supreme Council and had handled the terms of 2 war conclusions and 1 planetary annexation, and had a reputation as a man who never left the table without achieving at least part of what he came for, and his 2 advisors. They arrived in Geneva at the appointed time and were escorted into the conference room by a human aide who offered them water and said nothing else. The room was smaller than Tausurus expected. The table seated 12, and on one side were 3 chairs, on the other 3. Torres sat in the center, advisors on either side of him. Across the table sat Director Chen, a legal advisor whose name Tausurus had received in the briefing, and Commander Elina Vaskes, still in her uniform, dark blue with 1 stripe. Tausurus had been briefed on all 3. He had reviewed the tactical video. He had read Katarin's post-combat report. He arrived in Geneva with an offer that was sanctioned by the Supreme Council and which Tausurus personally considered more generous than he would have recommended given the circumstances, because the circumstances were what they were, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. He laid the offer on the table before the opening statements were finished. Full membership in the Interstellar Dominion, a seat in the External Assembly of the Council, trade access at member rates, fleet withdrawal already in progress, formal recognition that the construction of the Harbinger did not constitute a violation of the observer status terms, which was a legal reinterpretation that imperial lawyers had worked on all night and which Tausurus personally considered creative to the point of fiction. But it was all they had. It was a good offer. Tausurus had seen lesser civilizations accept lesser offers with greater gratitude. Chen listened to it all. Then he looked at Elina. Elina looked at Tausurus. "Is that the offer?" she said. "It wasn't a question. That is the offer," Tausurus said. "I think you will find it. We want full membership," Elina said. "We also want the framework of the observer status dissolved for all currently observing civilizations. Not just for us, for everyone." Tausurus paused. There were currently 11 civilizations in the Interstellar Dominion holding observer status. 11 species at various stages of development, sitting in the waiting room of the galactic community evaluated, observed, receiving the same polite and suppressed assessment Earth had received for 30 years. "That is outside the scope of this negotiation," Tausurus said. "We are including it in the scope," Elina said. "Observer status is a system designed to prevent developing civilizations from developing in ways you don't approve of. We understand the impulse. We also built 8 warships while holding observer status, so the system does not work as advertised." She let that hang for a moment. "Dissolve it. Offer membership tracks to all current observers. That is our condition." Tausurus looked at her, then at Chen. Chen had the expression of a person watching someone else do exactly what he would have done. "You are asking us to restructure 40 years of diplomatic structure," Tausurus said. "We are asking you to stop managing a waiting room for civilizations you decided weren't ready yet," Elina said. "You weren't right about us. There is a reasonable chance you were wrong about some others, too." Tausurus sat with that. He wasn't authorized for this. It wasn't in the scope of what the Supreme Council had instructed him for. He needed to send a response to the Council, and the Council needed to discuss it, and there would be factions against and for. And the entire machine of imperial rule would go through this question over weeks or months. "I will pass on the request," he said carefully. "Thank you," Chen said. The meeting lasted another 2 hours on secondary terms: trade protocols, communication frameworks, the formal recognition document. And when it ended and the imperial delegation was escorted back to their transport, Tausurus stopped at the door and looked back at Elina, who was still sitting at the table gathering her notes. "Commander," he said, "the fleet. 412 ships." He seemed to be choosing words. "You knew we would send it. We had assessments. You let us see exactly what you wanted us to see," Tausurus said. "You watched us for 30 years, envoy," Elina said. "It would have been strange not to pay attention." Tausurus left. The news spread quickly. Not all news spread quickly. The galaxy was large, and signals took time. But the corrective fleet withdrawing from a system it had entered with 412 ships and left with 291 was a signal that didn't need transmission. The withdrawal itself was a broadcast. The movement of a fleet that size left trails in a dozen independent sensor networks. The independent networks talked. History was being assembled from parts, raggedly and quickly, as it always is with big stories. By the time the Office of Public Affairs of the Interstellar Dominion released an official statement, careful language, minimal details, no numbers, no casualties, the story was already everywhere, and the official statement was already behind. In the outer systems, in the civilizations with observer status that had spent years in the same waiting room as Earth, the story spread faster than anywhere else. It spread at the speed of people telling it to each other, person to person, system to system. The specific speed of news that matters to the people receiving it. Not just that Earth had fought many civilizations, had fought the Empire. Some had fought well and lost and been absorbed. The battle wasn't the story. The story was 30 years of observation, learning, and secret construction, smiling at diplomatic receptions, and allowing Ash to photograph a ship they were ready to show. The story was that when the ultimatum came, they answered it with one vessel, the one everyone already knew about. And that one vessel was enough. And behind it were 7 more that no one knew about until the moment it was useful to know. The story was that they had never been who they were assessed as. They were who they were building, and the observers couldn't see it. In 11 different star systems, 11 different observing civilizations read this story. Some of them had been in the waiting room longer than Earth. Some of them had stopped building certain things quietly when Imperial observers noticed and filed reports. Some of them had empty docks for a long time. The docks were far from full, but the story had arrived, and the story was a kind of permission, and some of those docks would not remain empty. Elina returned to the Harbinger the evening after the diplomatic meeting. She had no specific reason. There was no planned launch, no systems check that required her physical presence. The ship was in the 7th dock under post-combat maintenance. Hull technicians were crawling over the port flank panels. The propulsion systems were running in a passive cooling mode. Weapon systems were locked down and logged for inspection. A controlled rest that a thing gets after it has worked. She walked up the gangway, and the ship accepted her weight and apologized for nothing. She walked through the corridors alone, past the crew quarters, most of them empty. The crew had been given 48 hours, and most had gone home to somewhere where the air didn't circulate through military filters, gone to be humans for a day before becoming crew again. Past the weapon bays, locked, the smell of burned metal still faintly lingering in the air outside the rail accelerator chambers. Past the engine room, where 2 technicians were running diagnostics and looked up when she passed, nodded, and stared back at their work. She went to the bridge, sat in the command chair. The screens were in standby mode. The main display showed an image of the star field, the same one she had looked at the night before the launch. But from the dock's position, it also showed the water through the external dock sensors. The harbor lights on the surface, the narrow strip of sky above the dock's open top, Earth sky. She had spent 4 hours fighting in the darkness between planets, and now she looked at the sky, and it was the same sky. It was always that same specific blue-gray color of late evening over water, and it was the most ordinary thing she had ever seen, and she couldn't stop looking at it. She thought about the document Chen had released, the 7 ships, the manifest with the photos. She thought about the fact that the manifest was the truth. The ships existed. The construction percentages were accurate. The images were real. She had insisted on it. No bluffing, nothing that didn't exist. The Empire would authenticate every line, and every line would authenticate cleanly, because the moment you showed them something false, you would spend the only thing you could never get back. She thought about what Tausurus had said. You let us see exactly what you wanted us to see. 30 years of careful observation. And they had never looked close enough, never asked the right question, never considered that a civilization in the waiting room might spend its time in the waiting room very productively. They had seen humans building something and assumed they knew what it was. They hadn't asked what humanity would do differently. That was the question. It was always the question not can they build it, but what will they build when they decide to build something entirely their own? The Harbinger had answered that question. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't elegant. It didn't look like it belonged under the same sky as the things built by the Empire. It looked like something built by people who weren't trying to fit into that sky, who were trying to conquer it. Elina sat in the command chair for a long time. Tomorrow there would be new meetings, terms to finalize, frameworks to develop, 11 observing civilizations sending quiet diplomatic requests that the Earth government would be forced to answer. The entire machine of a changed world would begin to move. Chen had a list of items 17 pages long that required her attention by the end of the week. But tonight, the ship was motionless, and the harbor lights were on the water, and somewhere above the open dock closing off the sky, it was the color it had always been. the specifically ordinary color of a planet she had taken one ship out to protect. She watched it until the light faded and the stars appeared. And the stars were the same stars they had always been. And they looked, for the first time, like something that was theirs.